Welcome to Long Blue Leadership, the podcast where we share insights on leadership through the lives and experiences of Air Force Academy graduates. I'm Navira Walkowitz, class of '99. In this edition of Long Blue Leadership, we're joined by someone whose journey is as inspiring as it is unconventional. Dr. John Torres, USAFA class of '82. You might know him as NBC's senior medical correspondent, but long before he was delivering public health insights to millions of viewers on national television, he started military life as a young cadet at our Air Force Academy, navigating his own path of purpose and transformation. Dr. Torres' story begins with life in a tight-knit Latino family with roots in northern New Mexico extending back to the 1500s, where he became the first in his family to go to college. He entered the academy from a high school where gangs and drugs were common, but it was the structure at USAFA and one pivotal summer of survival training that lit a fire in him. As a pilot, Dr. Torres discovered a calling beyond the cockpit, thanks in part to a chance conversation on a 3-hour flight leading him to medicine, where he would serve as a flight doc for more than 2 decades. Dr. Torres' leadership story extends beyond the emergency room. Whether mentoring NATO's Special Forces medics, stepping in front of a camera to deliver critical public health guidance, or reflecting on 43 years of marriage, he is fueled by his relentless curiosity about all things possible. I'm honored to welcome Dr. John Torres to Long Blue Leadership. His is a path that reminds us that leadership is a series of grounded values and bold steps. Dr. Torres, welcome to Long Blue Leadership.
Thanks for having me here.
Absolutely. We're really excited to jump in, and I want to go back to something we talked about. You were the first in your family to go to college. However, there was a period of time where you might have left the academy. Can we jump right in there?
Yeah, it's actually pretty interesting because it intuitively doesn't make sense for anybody that went through it. But it was my first year as a dual year, and as anybody who's gone through the dual year, it's a tough year to go through. Especially, you come out of high school. I remember I had hair down to my shoulders, and you come in here, they shave it off right away, and your parents leave, and you're sad, and everybody's sitting there going through the same stuff, but at the same time, it's just a tough thing to go through. And so I went through that. I went through basic training, and I was kind of like, I don't know if this is really where I want to be. I started the academy. I went to school, like you mentioned, a high school. It wasn't one of the best high schools in the country by any stretch of the imagination. So when I came here, it was kind of an eye-opener because I was here with people who had gone to very good high schools. And so I was a step behind academically. So I had to catch up as well through that. And so that made it a little bit tougher. So not just physically, not just mentally, academically, everything was kind of, just tough that year. And something as a 18-year-old you're not used to, a 19-year-old. And so I started looking at other schools thinking, I want to leave. And I talked to my dad, and he was an amazing person. He's always been one of my heroes in my life. And my dad, surprisingly, didn't say anything. He didn't say, like, you need to stay there. He was an Air Force, He retired Air Force, and, he really was proud that I was here. But at the same time, thankfully, he just said, you need to do what you need to do, and I'll back you regardless. I think you should stay there, and I'll back you regardless. But do me a favor. Go through survival training, go through SERI, because that will always stick with you for the rest of your life, whether you stay at the academy or not. And I felt like I owed him at least that. I'm like, let me go through SERI. Well, I went through SERI. I was the second iteration of summer.
And SERI, just a reminder, is survival, evasion, resistance, and
exactly,
yes,
our survival training.
Yes.
So I was the second iteration during the summer. You have 3 weeks, 3 weeks, 3 weeks. It was the second 3 weeks. And so I went through SERI, and it's not fun. It's certainly not. And I grew up in the outdoors. My dad was a big hunter. We used to go hunting together, a lot of camping. So I was used to outdoor things, but SERI is just a little bit different from that. Surprisingly, though, I really enjoyed it. And I enjoyed a lot of things.
You enjoyed SERI. I
enjoyed SERI, which is kind of bizarre. And when I went through, it gave me that sense of accomplishment that I had really done something. And I looked back and I said, I am in a lot different place than I would be even in this year I've been here, a little over a year. I think I'm going to stay. And so I ended up staying here at the academy, and that just kind of set the trend for the rest of my life.
I can't imagine anyone saying that they wanted to stay because of SERI, of survival training, versus, that is unique in itself.
Yeah, and like I said, it was just one of those things that when you got through, and the academy did this time and time again, and this led into other things in my life where you push hard through these adverse situations, and it gives you that sense of accomplishment. I can do these things. And it taught me that I could pretty much do anything in life I want. And I did a lot of things that, like you mentioned, are a little less than traditional, and were not always easy on myself or the family, but with the backing, in this case, of my parents throughout the life of my family, you can do anything.
Well, we're going to dig into that, but I want to ask you, was there a moment during survival training that you learned something about yourself? Because obviously it made you want to stay at the academy and continue that journey, but was there anything you learned?
What I did learn, because you don't learn this in high school. There were a few things. I was in different clubs and stuff, because even though the school I went to wasn't the best, we still had the different clubs and honor society and those kind of things. But I wasn't really a leader in any of those. I was just a participant in all those. Well, when I went through survival training, I found out that I was actually a leader in a lot of things. It just popped up, and I guess I could use the word natural leader. And part of it was, if you remember, during survival training, one of the things we had to do is we had a rabbit.
Yes, we had a rabbit as well.
You end up having to kill the rabbit, to eat the rabbit, to show you that you need to survive on these things, and it's okay to kill these animals to eat if you're trying to survive.
Right.
Again, I grew up hunting. And so I'm used to hunting animals and cleaning the animals and butchering them down and those things. And so when we had the rabbit, I was with other people, and nobody wanted to do anything with the rabbit. And we even gave it a name. And nobody wanted.
What was the name?
I can't remember.
No,
the name was Stu.
Oh.
For
rabbit
obvious
stew.
reasons. Rabbit
Yes,
stew.
that's fantastic.
We called the rabbit stew, and so people were petting the rabbit, and then when it came time, they're like, okay, now somebody needs to kill the rabbit. They're all sitting there. So I said, okay, fine, I'll do it. Give it to me. No, I did that. And then, okay, now somebody needs to skin the rabbit, and they're all looking too. I'm like, give it to me. Oh, come on. So I ended up gutting, skinning, killing the whole rabbit and all those things. And then when we did the hiking part of survival training, the evasion part, it was the same thing, where I was like, I ended up leading the group we were with through a lot of the situations we were in. And so it just showed me that I had that leadership potential that I didn't know was there. And that was one of the things I think that clicked during that survival training.
That's amazing. And you'd mentioned that your dad also served in the military. So talk a little bit about how he was a hero for you, I guess, in your journey as well.
So he came, like you mentioned, I was the first one to go to any kind of college or university. He actually dropped out of high school when he was 15 because his mother had died earlier. His father died at that point. He had 8 siblings, and he was trying to raise all this. No, I'm sorry, he had 10 siblings. There were 11 children. He was trying to raise all the children, so he became essentially their surrogate father. And the best way he could do that he thought, was to go into the military and then send a lot of his money back to help out the family.
Wow.
Very, very poor childhood, very, very poor family. And so he was doing that. And then he had us as a family. And so he was taking care of 2 families, working extra jobs, doing all these things. And yet he was super dedicated as far as the military went. And if you look, I ended up getting his military records to look at him a few years ago. And 2 Bronze Stars. I mean, recommendations everywhere. Everybody loved him. He took care of an orphanage when we were in Greece, and that's where I was born. When he was stationed there, and there's letters from the orphanage thanking him for taking care of him. I mean, this man did amazing amounts of things, and he did that. He grew up in a very adverse situation, a very harsh situation, and he overcame that. Never was bitter about anything. Always was looking at other things he could do, and always really encouraging in us, his children, you can do anything you want to do. You can be anybody you want to be. You just have to really put your nose to the grindstone and really do it. And he was adamant about that, as far as, not just can you do anything you want to do, but you have to earn that ability to do what you want to do. You have to figure out a way to do that.
Wow. So his values really aligned with the Air Force Academy and kind of the values that we are brought up through. Talk about your time at the Academy, because I like you use the word unconventional. Let's talk about a little bit of unconventionality at the Air Force Academy.
So I went to the Air Force Academy, like Gabrielle, in 27th Squadron my dually year, and ended up going to 39th at Jedi Knights the other years. And bizarrely, so my roommates of my dually year one of them ended up being my roommate all 4 years, which is really unique.
That doesn't happen often.
We ended up staying together, best friends. This guy is fantastic. And so we helped each other get through the whole thing, and you sit there the whole time, especially your dually year, learning certain things about yourself. And one of the things that I learned, and I talked about here at the Academy a few months ago, is what I call the no excuse saying. Yes. And it's tough because when you're growing up as a teenager, you're always like, giving excuses for everything. Why'd this happen? Well, my sister did it, and I didn't. It was my fault. Stuff. And if you remember at the Air Force Academy, anytime they would ask you a question, why did this happen? Why did you do this? Why was that wrong? Your only answer could be no excuse, sir, or no excuse, ma'am. You couldn't give an excuse. And at the time, I was like, that's dumb because I didn't even do it. My roommate did it. So I should tell them my roommate did it and all that stuff. And then over time, I realized, especially when I became an upperclassman, but what that is doing is that is instilling in you the fact that, hey, I have to take responsibility for this. It might have been my roommate that did it, but I'm part of this room too. I'm part of this team. I need to take responsibility. And so that just started the whole program of going through. Then when I was a freshman, you do intramurals and you look at other things you can do. I went and looked at Honor Society, and I did that for a little bit, and it wasn't really my cup of tea. It wasn't really something I wanted to do. And then I ended up, somebody told me about being a falconer, and I never really heard about that, the falcons. And so I went down there.
And you knew not to hunt this one. And,
I knew not to hunt.
Field dress it. Okay.
Exactly. So I went down there. And I started working with them, and it's just fell in love with it. So I became a falconer while I was here as well.
And that's really competitive.
That is very competitive, yeah. And I think there were 20 or 30 of us that started out, and they picked 4 of us.
Right.
Yeah, and so in the first year, you're just taking care of the chickens they eat. You're cleaning up falcon poop. I mean, you're just doing the things that nobody wants to do. Every now and then you get to hold a falcon and learn about them, and then they pick the ones who are going to stay, and then you start working with falcons for the next few years. Fantastic. And that helped throughout my life as well.
Right. How would you say that that's helped throughout your life? I mean, what a unique experience. Would you say that that's guided you to kind of try new things, or has it guided you in other ways?
Well, both. One, to try new things, because, again, this falls into that thought of, if I really want to do this, I can do it. Again, there were so many people competing for it that you just really have to make that extra effort. You really have to be consistent with what you're doing. You really have to commit. And so did all those things. Obviously, they saw that I was somebody who would do that, and they picked me. But the other thing it did, and like you mentioned, I've been a huge communicator the last 10, 15 years on TV, upwards of 10 million, 15 million people watching me. And it's a public health message I'm getting out there. So I have to be very accurate in what I say. I have to be you also have to be slightly entertaining, because people won't listen to you if you're dull, right? So you have to be a little bit entertaining, but you have to get the information across in a very timely fashion. And that's what falconeering taught me at the academy, because being a falconer, when you talk to people, you have to be able to elaborate on the falcon. And I distinctly remember it was Colonel Shad. He was our AOC, and this is back in the 80s. 70s and 80s. One time I was with the peregrine falcon that we had, which is an endangered species, and we had one of them, and the government let us have that one just to take care of it and raise it. And I was at a game with the peregrine falcon, and somebody came up to me, and I was a third year. Somebody came up to me, and they said, "What kind of falcon is that?" And I said, "Oh, it's a peregrine falcon." They're like, we kind of stared at each other, and they're like, "Oh." It was a family with kids, and they're like, "Oh, thanks." And then they turned and walked away, and Colonel Shad was with me. He came over. He's like, "You completely missed the boat." I'm like, "What are you talking about?" He goes,
"You're like, I got it right."
He said, "You need to use that as an opening, because they need to understand these falcons are endangered and all stuff." He said, "So let me show you how to do this, and try it yourself." And so what he eventually taught me is to use that as opening lines, but then to go ahead and get into essentially my spiel of things that are important for them to understand. And so if somebody came up and said, "What kind of falcon is that?" Well, this is a peregrine falcon. Here's something you might not know. This is the fastest animal on Earth. They can dive at 180 miles an hour, but they're also an endangered species. So something we really need to take care of, blah, blah, blah. And just keep that dialogue going as long as you can, or as long as you need to, and not just answering the question with a simple answer. And so when I got into television, and especially since I give across medical information, which can be confusing and can be even in some places controversial, I learned from there how to adjust the answer to the question, but also get in the information I think needed to be got in.
Well, I certainly hope that the peregrine falcon details were not in contrails, because I didn't remember that. I learned something right now.
There you go.
I didn't realize it was that fast.
Yeah, it's very fast.
Wow.
They're amazing.
That's incredible. And that's what a neat story, how that's actually led into the way you communicate. But let's talk about a day in the life now. So you're an NBC correspondent. You're a medical doctor. What's a day in the life like?
So right now, it changes depending on the situation. So if we go back a couple of years during the pandemic, that was kind of, as somebody put it, that was kind of my Super Bowl in the pandemic, because I was on every day. I think in the 3 years of the pandemic, I had a total of 5 days off, because it was just Monday through Monday kind of thing, where you're just constantly on. My claim to fame is one day I was on 27 times a day, to the point where my producer, thankfully for my wife, she was there helping. She was part camera person, part, helping me out with other things. And my producer would call my wife and say, "Get him a peanut butter sandwich. He looks like he's hungry. We have a minute and a half between hits. And so, the pandemic, if you remember, things were happening fast and furious. And so I was always having to keep on top of the information, get that information out as accurately as possible. So that was the pandemic. Well, now it's gotten more relaxed. And so now the main thing I do is get on air. I have a studio in my house here in Colorado, and I'll get on air probably 5 or 6 times a week and talk about various medical things that are happening, like recently with former President Biden and his prostate cancer. Get on and discuss why the PSA test might not have caught it. What does that mean? What does that mean for? And then I use that, like I talked about with the falcon. I use that to give other people. Well, here's what men need to understand, and the women in their lives need to understand about signs they could look at that might preclude them to going to might urge them to go to the doctor.
Right.
And so you learn these things as you go along. And right now, that's what I'm doing. I'm mainly focusing on whatever the news of the day is and going ahead and getting on air and describing what that means for people, but describing kind of both sides of the story, because we found out during the pandemic that people want to hear both sides. They don't want to just hear me as a doctor telling them what to do. They want to hear the pros and cons to certain things and then help them make a decision.
Right. Well, it's interesting how you became a doctor, because I mentioned in the opening that you were a pilot. So maybe we can visit that correlation, how that happened, because you are unconventional. How did this come about?
So I went to the Air Force Academy, and actually it was interesting. When I went to the academy, I wanted to be an architect.
Oh.
Yeah, as bizarre as that can be, and mainly because when I was in high school, I had taken a drafting course, and I was like, this is really fun. I really enjoy this kind of stuff. And so when I got here, I'm like, I want to be an architect. And they're like, and this is how little I knew about the academy. They're like, we don't have architects.
I was going to say,
we don't have architects
public
here.
Service announcement for you.
So I was like, okay, let me see what else I can do. And then it was one of those things, well, everybody's going to be a pilot, so I might as well be a pilot. But I got my degree in engineering mechanics. And so I thought, that's as close as I can get, and I'll go ahead and do the pilot thing. So I did the pilot thing. I was flying C-130s at the time, and one of my fellow pilots, we were on the plane together. We were heading to the plane. He's got his helmet bag. And inside, I look at his helmet bag, and he's got a chemistry book in there. I'm like, dude, I hated chemistry. I hated chem. What are you doing with chemistry book? He's like, oh, I'm studying for the MCATs. And I'm like, this is how little I knew. I'm like, what are the MCATs? He goes, it's the medical college admission test. I'm like, what does that mean? He goes, oh, I want to go to medical school and be a doctor. I'm like, what? You can do that? He's like, oh yeah, I'm just studying for it. I'll take the MCATs in another year or two. And so we had a 3-hour flight, and I just picked his brain about it and said, why are you doing this? What is this? And then afterwards, over the next couple of days, I'm like, I'm as smart as this guy. I could go to medical school. And so I started looking into it too. And then I made the huge step, which was talking to my wife about it. Because she was like, are you going to go in the airlines? What are you going to do? And she was 100% not even questioning. If that's what you want to do, let's do it. I said, it's not going to be easy. And you find out in med school that if anybody out there who might think about going to med school, or their kids are, it has to be a calling, because it's not easy. And my friends are all flying for the airlines, are making good money. They're having great vacations, they're raising families, stuff. I'm raising a family, but we're living in a 500 square foot apartment. There's 4 of us, and barely living off loans. And so it's definitely a calling. And I think the academy helped me with that as well, of going, again, that if I really want it, I really have to earn it. But it's that 3-hour flight with that fellow co-pilot that started the process.
So I'm curious, you said it really needs to be a calling. What was it about it to you? You hadn't thought about it before that flight.
So the only thing that going back in my life, when I was in high school, again, this is that high school you were talking about, I had a biology teacher that came up to me one day and he said, you're pretty smart. You should think about becoming a doctor. And he's the only person ever to have told me that. And I had no idea what that really meant. And I was like, yeah, whatever. When I graduated from medical school, I actually invited him to my graduation, and he came, and I honored him at the graduation. And so it was really neat, because he was the first one, a guy named Mr. Graubard. He was the first one to do that, to say anything to me, the first one to mention it. And so when I was after that flight, I was talking to my wife, and it started going, wait, I remember him saying this. So he must have seen something in me. Maybe I wasn't the best academic person at the Air Force Academy, but then you come to find out that, hey, not being kind of middle of the road at the Air Force Academy puts you at a pretty high status across the country compared to other colleges. And then when I went to apply for the academy, I was surprised, and this is the first time I'd seen anything outside of the military, that I was surprised at how well received having gone to the academy was both the fact that academically I'd gotten through it, but also the fact that they knew that that meant that, yes, because I would get through medical school, I would get through residency, and I'd be able to do what it takes to be a doctor, because the last thing they want to do is bring somebody on board who 2 years later is going to quit, because that's a spot that somebody else could have taken.
Right. Well, gosh, I mean, being a flight doc, I mean, you had some high pressure moments. I can't even imagine some of the things you experienced and seen. Maybe talk about what you've learned about yourself in that period, or maybe the leadership journey in that space.
So the being a flight doc was fantastic, especially the fact that I had been a pilot before. And so, for the pilots that are out there, we used to always have a saying as a pilot that when you go to the flight doc, the best you can do is break even, meaning the best you can do is come out the same way you went in.
Okay.
Otherwise they're going to find something and you're going to be grounded and all these other things. And so I remember that when I was a flight doc, that pilots coming in, they tend to be a bit nervous and they tend to be a bit skeptical and they tend to hold back information because they want to make sure they break even. Right. They want to make sure they go back to flying. And so I would always talk to them about, hey, I was in your shoes. I fully understand. So let's talk about these things that we can talk about freely. And if there's things you're holding back, as long as it's not endangering you or you're flying, I understand. At the same time, the hardest thing was to deliver news to a pilot that, like, hey, we're going to have to, ground you for a while, and this might be permanent because of some medical condition that came up. I fully understand because I was in the same boat. But look, also at the same time, you can do other things in your life. You don't necessarily, like most pilots, not being a pilot isn't the end of things.
Right.
But even though you think it might be. And so it gave me that ability to discuss that as well.
So would you say at that juncture, you're obviously a leader. Would you say that there's some of them are almost peers, or you're always kind of in a supervisor kind of role in that as a flight doc?
As a flight doc, so I think you're in a peer position,
okay.
And you should treat it as a peer position, because if you treat it as a leadership supervisory position, then you're coming down. And it's the same thing now with medicine in 2025 versus medicine in 1960 or 70. In 1960 or 70, the doc was the authority figure. The doc was, it was very uncommon for anybody to talk back to a doctor and say, I don't agree with that. Well, we've learned over the years that people want a discussion, they want a dialogue, they want to make their own medical decisions, which they should make. And it's the same thing here with being a flight doctor. Last thing I want to be is the authority figure that says, here's what you're going to do. I want to be the figure that sits there with them as a peer and say, here's what medicine is saying. If we go down this avenue, this will happen. If we go down Avenue B, this will happen. If we go down Avenue C, this will happen. Which avenue do you think we should go down, based on you and your life and where you are right now? Because everybody's individual.
Right.
You don't know where they are in their life, and you want to make sure that you don't assume where they are in their life.
Did you come into the role with that mentality and that way of communicating and working with them, or was that something that you learned over time? Did you see that from another leader?
I think it was a combination of the two. I think part of it was growing up, and again, with my father always encouraging me to do things and always encouraging me to make sure that there are going to be things that are going to be hard, but you can get through that and you can earn that. And don't ever let anybody tell you you're not good enough, because you are. And you need to show them that. But you're also taking off on a bit of a different step than other people, because there are some racial components to things. And being Latino, oftentimes you're a step back. And so you want to make sure that you're putting the best step forward. And so going through life, kind of learn that, but also watching leaders and how they did things, both when I was here at the academy and when I was in the Air Force, and even through medical school, the doctors that were good and talked to people appropriately, the leaders that were good, and they had the men and women following them because they wanted to follow them versus following them because they had to follow them. And as you know, there's a huge difference there. And I try to model myself after the ones who had people that followed them because they wanted to follow them. They respected them. They earned that respect. They earned that loyalty. And to me, that was always an important thing. And so when I transitioned over to medicine, especially being a flight doc, I wanted them to do the things that medically were important for them because they wanted to, because they trusted me and they understood that I was looking out for them, and not just their career or not just their flying, but looking out for them and their families and their health in particular.
Wow, you certainly led with compassion. Absolutely. So how did you get into becoming an NBC correspondent? Because again, I'm trying to follow this road and I have to hop onto another track.
Yeah, it's a very bizarre road. So when I was in the emergency room, I was working down in Pueblo at an emergency room. This is in 2000 or 2001. We had a Hantavirus outbreak, and for those who don't know what Hantavirus is, it's a mouse-borne virus that at the time when it was first discovered in the 90s had a 70% mortality rate. Now it's down to about 40%, so it's still pretty deadly. And so for those that recently remember the news, Gene Hackman's wife, she ended up dying from Hantavirus in Santa Fe, New Mexico. So it's it's not common, but it happens in New Mexico. When I went to med school and residency, that's when they discovered the first cases. And at the time, we had no idea what it was. So, being a resident, being a student, you're involved in a lot that's going on, especially being a resident, ended up taking care of a lot of Hantavirus patients. Well, when I was in Pueblo, again, 2000, 2001, we had Hantavirus outbreaks, and you would get 5 a season, 8 a season kind of thing. And we had a cluster of 5, which obviously made the news. And so they kept coming to the emergency room talking to us, and they wanted to talk to a doctor. And I was on shift, and all the other doctors, number one, didn't want to be on camera, and number two, didn't know anything about Hantavirus. So they kept putting me in front of the camera. And again, doing the full circle, I would think back to my falconer days of like, okay, how do I get this conversation across eloquently with good information and not just a yes or no answer? And so I channeled that. And after about the 5th time, I said, I'm really busy here in the ER. Don't you have your own doctor that you can use? And they're like, no, do you want to do it? And I'm like, okay, I'll try it. It was absolutely horrible. Oh my gosh.
I can't even imagine you being horrible.
Unbelievably horrible. I would stumble. I would stop. I would freeze up at the camera. And then you learn over time that, hey, what they say is just pretend like you're talking to a person. Don't pretend like you're talking to a camera. Pretend like you're talking to a person. And my thing is I would always sit there going, okay, if I had somebody in my room, in the clinic room, and I was talking to them as a patient, how would I talk to them? And so that's what I do on TV. I just talk like that. And so that started very sporadically in a station here in Colorado, and then it moved to a station in Denver. And then NBC saw me in 2015, and they said, hey, why don't you come over here and try out, just give us an audition. And so I went over there, did an audition. They're like, we want you. And I was like, I don't know what that means. And so it was full time, and it was, like I said, and then obviously 2020, the pandemic broke out, and then that was super full time.
Right. So going back to an earlier comment, you said it was like the Super Bowl for you at that time during the pandemic. So oftentimes, in sports, the Super Bowl is like the highest, and you either strive to get back there. So what does that look like for you now? I mean, I don't think we want to go back to the pandemic. So what would the Super Bowl look like for you?
Would never strive to go back there.
Right.
But it was a Super Bowl in the fact that it brought a lot of attention to medical issues and medical concerns, because up until then, we were kind of like a peripheral service for the media. Mm-hmm. If there was a big medical story, they would hit it every now and then. So this was happening every now and then, and I would go weeks without being on TV because not much was happening. Well, what happened is then, and again, I'm using the Super Bowl analogy as more of the attention. The attention that it got is medicine became the focus, and so for 2 years of the 3 years, medicine was the sole focus, and we were, the tip of the spear for media. Every day, medicine came out every day, and the way it works, especially at the national channels, is they have like a biz tech unit, a climate unit, a health unit, all these different units, and every unit would want some information about what medicine meant. Like tech would want to know, okay, what's happening with the vaccine because it could affect the prices of the stock. The climate would want to know, is climate affecting the way that's spreading? What does that mean?
Right.
And so we were feeding in all this information and going on air and talking about it. And so after the pandemic, medicine still stayed in the forefront here. And so now it's one of those things, when you look at it, it's probably one of at least the top 3, if not top 2 of, they always want to know something about medicine, about health. And because people are very interested in their health, but it did switch things a little bit, because again, before it was more an authoritarian, here's what you need to know. During and afterwards, it became more of a conversation of, here's the information, pros and cons. You're going to need to make a decision, but the decision is based on information, accurate information. And for you, it might be different than it would be for me.
So I'm thinking about you delivering this information to millions of viewers. I mean, just the thought of being the voice of information, and, the pressure, you're really focused on accuracy, but also helping them understand it, because medical terms can be very confusing. What is that like for you? Is that challenging, or do you just kind of think about it as a one-person conversation?
It's interesting because you always go back in life to things that were turning moments in life.
Mm-hmm.
And like I mentioned, the turning moment, the co-pilot I was with, being a falconer with that peregrine falcon, these different ones, the high school biology teacher that was like, you should be a doctor, all these different things. Well, the turning point here is essentially, how do you end up looking at these things and how do you end up talking about these things? And when I was in medical school or residency, I can't remember which, I had an attending physician one time that would basically every 4 or 5 days you do rounds. Mm-hmm. And so in the morning you go in there and you do rounds and you present to the attending. So you're just either the student or the resident, and you have this, well-seasoned attending doctor who's been there on whatever round it is, and you tell them about the patient, the condition, here's the test you ran, here's the test you want to run, and here's what you think that we should be doing over the next 24 hours. And they critique you on it. And we can get back to this because it was interesting because people were like, you can tell you went to an academy because of the way you handle this. But one attending I had in particular used to say, today, pretend like I'm your 85-year-old grandfather. So explain to me like I'm 85 years old. And you'd say something like, like in medicine, if somebody has a fever, we said they're febrile. And we go, this patient is febrile. Huh? Mm-hmm. Oh, I'm sorry. They have a fever. Oh, okay. We're going to do this. What? And so we'd have to. So I learned to explain to people on terms that they would understand, and not using medical terms because it's its own dialogue, it's its own language.
Yes.
And so he was fantastic because again, every time you used anything medical, he would just what? Huh? I don't understand. And so you'd have to bring it to a level that they understood, meaning you had to talk to them unlike physicians talk to each other. And so that I channel that on air of like, let me explain to you, and I try very hard not to use statistics or medical terms that somebody might not understand, or if I do, I try to explain them as best as possible.
What an incredible lesson. I mean, that's fantastic. I think listeners in general, it can be across any kind of, function or specialty. Really, think about how someone needs to receive the information to understand it.
Yeah, an interesting side note is when I was going through, so when you're going through rounds, oftentimes you get a physician who isn't the nicest person on earth, and they'll yell at you, or they're yelling at you for right reasons. You did something wrong, and they'll yell at you, and you do it right, all stuff. And there's usually 4 other either students or residents on the rounds with you, and they would yell at all of us. And one day, my fellow residents or students, I can't remember where we were, they said, I think it was med students, they're sitting there going, it's really interesting. They said, when the attending yells at us, you're the only one. It doesn't seem like it affects you at all. Everybody else is sitting there quakering in their boots, and but it doesn't seem to bother you. And I said, okay, here's the deal. I said, I went to the Air Force Academy. I said, I was yelled at by the best. And so after a year, a good almost full year of getting yelled at, you get kind of used to it. And so this is nothing.
That's fantastic. That would indicate you're a Service Academy graduate.
There you go.
That's great. Wow. So that's a really unique story in how you share information. I'm really curious. How have you dealt with having to give, sometimes negative or bad news, and and you talk about being energetic and sharing information, but if it's not good news, how do you do that?
One of the things I learned a long time ago is you have to match your facial. Basically, you have to match how you're feeling to how you're looking. Mm. And so, if I'm talking about a subject that's, the death rate from breast cancer, I have to make sure. So one time somebody told me that this is early on. This is back when I was first starting, 15 years ago plus. They said, you were talking about death rates from breast cancer and you were smiling, and it was kind of creepy. And so I learned at that point, I'm like, that's true, because this is an audio visual thing. And so the audio and the visual have to match, and not that you're being fake, not that you're being incorrect, but just that you're being honest with yourself and how do you feel inside. And so I try to get that emotion behind what I'm talking about as well, and make sure that if I'm talking about something that is not happy, that I'm not smiling and joking around. Definitely never try to be clownish. Right. I might joke around a little bit, and I love dad jokes. And so I'll joke around, I'll tell dad jokes, I'll tell those kind of things. We do a program for kids, and I'll be with kids. I'm always joking around and keep things as lighthearted, especially during the pandemic, because they were scared about a lot of things, and trying to bring it to a level where, hey, this, like the big question, they said old people are going to die. Is my grandma and grandpa going to die? I'm like, that does not mean your grandma and grandpa are going to die. That just means that typically older people are the ones that are more likely to have issues from this. So you just want to be careful around them, that kind of thing. So you learn how to do that. And I also learned from medicine when I was doing the emergency room, because oftentimes you had to deliver bad news to patients' families, that the patient had passed away. And so I was always, at least in my mind, very cognizant of the fact that when I went in there, they're looking at everything. They're looking at me, they're listening to me, and this is going to be something that's going to be imprinted in their mind for the rest of their life. I want to make sure that I handle it emotionally correctly.
Wow, the gravity of that for sure. So talking about what you've had to do as an NBC correspondent, and then also we talked about you're doing some training right now as well.
I am. That's the other facet of my life I'm doing as well. And so
you're like a diamond. We just turn it and let's talk about this side now.
My wife calls me the chameleon. You're a chameleon. Now you're going out there. You're doing this. So I teach NATO Special Forces medics and supporters of the medics. And so we go out there and we teach a lot of different classes. One of the biggest ones I teach right now is what we call an instructor development course, where I teach TCCC, which is Tactical Combat Casualty Care, how to survive on the battlefield, but I also teach them how to teach other people.
Oh, it's like a train the trainer.
Yeah, it's a train the trainer method, but it's a trainer method for special forces, which is a bit unique in the way they train people and the way they get trained, because their hierarchy is a bit different, and the way you approach things are a bit different, and the things they care about, and more particularly the things they don't care about, vastly different, because these are the folks, especially in NATO, and we're talking across all the countries of NATO, that are out there, that nobody really knows about, or doing things that nobody really knows about that are very dangerous.
Right.
And so these guys are very serious about what they do and how they do it, and they just want to know the information they need. Mm-hmm. They don't want to know the information they don't need, and they want to know how to use that to keep themselves and their fellow soldiers alive.
Dare I ask how that came about?
Oh, that came about actually at an academy football game, believe it or not.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. So I was at an academy football game. This is years ago.
Okay.
And I met this fellow doc friend of mine, and we were talking, and he said, I'm starting up this program teaching NATO Special Forces medics. I think you'd be a great teacher, especially being an ER doc. Do you want to do that? And I was like, well, let's talk more about it. And so we talked more and went out there, and we started this program back in 2010, 2011, and then just worked this program through. And now we have a variety of courses we teach. I go out probably 4 or 5 times a year and teach different courses. And these guys, again, are phenomenal, because we teach medical planning, we teach tactical combat casualty care, and how to instruct tactical combat casualty care. And the guys we're teaching are just amazing.
I bet so.
Yeah.
One of the things you said earlier, I think it was during your 27 appearances in one day, your wife was bringing you a peanut butter sandwich.
She did.
Yes. I would love to talk about the role of your family in all of these different experiences you've had in leadership and your impact. What's that been like for them?
So, one, it's been great because they love the ride. They love going along. My wife's always like, I'm just curious what's going to happen next, because I always take her everywhere with me. We always go together, and she's obviously very, very integral part of my life. We got married right at the academy, right after graduation.
Did you meet her at the academy?
I met her at the academy.
Okay.
She went to the University of Colorado, and we met actually in Monument.
Okay.
When I was a junior, when I was a second year, and then we got married after graduation. Been married ever since. She went through all the pilot training with me, all the different assignments, some good, some not as good, as you know, in the military, the deployments and everything. And then when I sat down and said, I'm thinking of going to med school, she was like 100% behind. Let's do it.
Wow. Do
what we need to do. And it was a huge sacrifice on her part. We opened up a couple clinics, and she was the business manager behind those, which was phenomenal. And the kids were behind us. They worked in there and they did stuff.
Wow.
And the kids have never really been complaining about it. They've always looked forward to it. And now I see them as adults going through a variety of things themselves, where they keep looking for different adventures, basically. And I think that's part of the way they grew up. And so now they're looking at it going, hey, I could do this. And the mindset I always try to put in them, and my wife and I together, is if you want to do something, do it. Mm-hmm. The last thing you want to do is be 80 years old and going, I wish I'd really done that one thing. And so just do it. Life's short. Just make sure you do it. But could not have done it without the family, and can't overstate that they are definitely the driving factor behind all this. And then when I went from medicine to NBC, again, sat down with them and going, they want me. And my wife was actually the one like, you're doing this.
Oh, wow.
And I'm like, well, I don't know if, no, you're doing this. You've been talking about this for a while. You're going to go. And so, yeah, that's the rest is history.
Wow. Well, we've seen the values passed on, 300 years of your family, right? Extended family, through your dad into you. What would you say that the legacy or the maybe the traits beyond adventure have you shared with your children and that you're seeing through them now?
And I think the biggest things are the one we just talked about. If you think you want to do something, you really want to do it, then go ahead and do it. Both my children are physicians now, and so they both. It was interesting because neither one of them wanted to be physicians, and I think they didn't want to be physicians because they didn't want to be like Dad, right? They wanted to do their own thing. And then partway through college, they both came to me individually and said, I think I want to do this. I'm like, hey, if you do, like we mentioned, you really got to want to do. You really have to want to do this. You can't do it just on a whim because it's going to take a lot of effort and a lot of work. And they've seen that, but they're all happy where they are right now, which is great. The other thing I think I've instilled in them is to, essentially just be a good person. Be kind of other people. Always think about other people and where they are in life, and always realize that one as a physician, but also as just a person, especially as a father or husband or wife, that somebody is coming at you angrily or somebody is coming at you awkwardly, just think about where they might be right now. And my wife has a great quote I always attribute to her, because she used to always tell our staff this when we had a couple clinics, is patients would come in angry and shouting and screaming. She was an elementary school counselor. And so one of the big things she learned that she always instilled in us and me and the children is the outward expression of fear is anger. And so they're angry probably because they're afraid of something. And it could be they're afraid of the medical condition they have, the medical condition you might be telling them they have, the finances they have in their life. If it's not medicine, if you just meet somebody that outside, there's something in their life that's driving that fear, which is driving that anger. And so basically give them a break. It's easy to take a step back. And the other thing I've always tried to instill in them is, two things. One is always just take a breath. Don't knee-jerk react. Always just take a breath and take a step back and think about the things you're going to do. And the other one is realizing that, tomorrow's another day. And tomorrow you can really think about what happened today and put it in a different perspective.
That's fantastic advice. And I'm going to take that quote. I think that's wonderful. I really like your wife.
Oh, she's fantastic.
Yes. So one of the things we like to ask our guests are basically how you get better each day to be a better leader. So what are some of the things you're doing on a daily basis to be better?
So the one thing for medicine in particular, the one thing I do is, as you saw when I came in here,
Yes.
I'm on the phone, I'm looking because there's some committee meetings right now, medical committee meetings that might be important, might not. But I always try to keep in touch with the latest news and the latest developments, especially at the higher levels of what's going on in the country, in research, in the scientific field, because I want to make sure I get that information across as best as possible. And then just on a daily basis, just kind of look at where I am and what I've done, what I've talked to other people about, and where I want to go from here. And it's, one of the big questions I get from people all the time is, when are you going to retire? And I'm 65 right now. And my answer to them is that, I never want to be, and, some people can do this, and fantastic for them that can do this, but I never want to be the person that's on my deck in her chair, just staring out at the landscape and just sitting there going, this is life. To me, for some people, fantastic. Mm-hmm. For me, I always want to be essentially paying it forward, giving it back, and talking to other people and trying to give them some information I might know, or at least help them get the information that I think they should know or might need to know.
That's fantastic advice. What might you share then that others can do as they're trying to aspire to, become better leaders? What's something that they can do to get there?
So a couple things. One is look at the leaders you have right now and see which ones you like and which ones you don't really want to model yourself after, because oftentimes it's pretty obvious. And the ones you like, just start looking at that and experimenting with a little bit and saying, okay, in this case, this happened. Let me tweak my answer a little bit. Let me tweak my approach a little bit. And then one of the things that the other thing I always instilled in my children is, and I got this from my father too and my mother, was I call it the "does this make sense" rule. And so when things are happening, especially if you get some information that you're going to pass on to your subordinates or you're going to pass on to in my case, patients or the public, always take a step back, take that breath and go, does this make sense? Does it make sense? And this, for lack of anything else to say, back when there were the theories about chips in the vaccines, does it make sense that they would put chips in the vaccines? from a perspective of overall perspective, probably not. And so start looking at things like that and just taking a step back and saying, what am I about to do? Does that make sense? The information I got, does that make sense on a basic level? And if I think it doesn't make sense, dig into it a little bit more. Because it might, but it might not.
Right.
But at the same time, it gives you that step to go forward with it. And then as a leader, always be willing to say, I was wrong. That's one of the toughest things. As a doctor, on TV, I've had to do that a couple times. Always be willing to go, I was wrong. What I told you, what I said was not accurate, or, I shouldn't have yelled at you guys yesterday for whatever I yelled at you for. That was incorrect. That was inappropriate. But if the decision you made was wrong, if the information you got was wrong, just being able to say that and basically step up and go, this one's on me.
Was that something you saw in someone, or you just learned that things went a little bit better when you kind of accepted that?
So it was a combination of both, and this goes back to medical school too. Mm-hmm. The doctors that you really aspired to be like were the ones that were willing to sit there and go, I was wrong about what I thought you have, and here's what we're going to do now. Here's what I think it is, and go. And you sit there really going, wow, that was a tough thing to say, especially as a doctor, because you're supposed to be this figure of like, everything. Mm-hmm. And then I extended that into, both television and my military issues as well, of going, hey, and you see those leaders that are willing to go, hey, I was wrong about that decision. Let's move on and do something correctly now.
Right. That's fantastic advice. Well, we're going to get to your final thoughts here shortly. But before we do, I want to invite you to watch Long Blue Leadership on Tuesdays every month in both video and audio, and it's available on all your favorite podcast platforms. Be sure to watch, listen, and subscribe to all episodes of Long Blue Leadership at longblueleadership.org. So, Dr. Torres, we've had an amazing time together, but I want to get some final thoughts for you. What might you want to share with our listeners that we didn't cover today?
I think the big thing is, if you want to do something, then do it. The academy, oftentimes while you're at the academy, you often question why you're there. After the academy, you sometimes question, why did I go through that? All my friends went through fun stuff and I didn't, kind of thing. But I think you need to realize that gives you that leg up in life. It gives you a different approach, a different thing you've done in life that other people don't do. Mm-hmm. And it gives you that confidence of like, I can do these things. I can do anything I want to do because look what I went through already. These other people that I'm a bit jealous of because they went to a regular university and they had a blast for 4 years and all that fun. They didn't have to go through these strenuous things I went through. They didn't have to jump through these hoops I went through. They didn't have to accomplish these things I accomplished. And so, not that I'm a better person than them, but I've already proven that I can do these things and I can do the things I want to do. And I think that's probably the biggest thing. And then when you're out there and you're leading other people, because at some point in life you will lead other people, remember the leaders that you really looked at and you really appreciated, and use them as mentors, even if they're not here, for how they dealt with things. And then just experiment around a little bit. And if you have to pull back and say, that's probably not the route to go, then go somewhere else.
Wonderful. Well, I'm not going to ask you when you're going to retire, but I'll ask you, what's next for you?
So next for me is essentially just keeping up with this, the NATO Special Forces training. We're actually accelerating that a little bit. TV, continuing to do that as well. And then hopefully, read more books and just enjoy life a little bit more, which, number one, I enjoy it phenomenally, but just, take a little bit of a breather.
Wonderful. Well, we appreciate you so much. Thank you for being on Long Blue Leadership. I'm Navira Walkowitz. Thanks for joining us. Until next time. Thank you for joining us for this edition of Long Blue Leadership. The podcast drops every 2 weeks on Tuesdays and is available on all your favorite podcast apps. Send your thoughts, comments, and guest ideas to us at socialmedia@usafa.org and listen to past episodes at longblueleadership.org.